Section 1. Setting the scene. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. It had been a long week, and I welcomed the silence after a day of chaotic meetings and fleeting deadlines. My son, Ethan, usually bustling with energy, had been unusually withdrawn lately. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft tick of the clock on the wall, everything felt calm, but there was a subtle undercurrent of something more. Ethan was 14, an age where curiosity could be both innocent and dangerous. As his mother, I had always tried to stay involved, checking in on him without smothering. We had our routine. I'd ask about his day at school, he'd give me a few one-word answers, and we'd share dinner in silence, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. Tonight, however, something was different. I hadn't seen him since the afternoon when he'd bolted up the stairs to his room, his steps heavy and hurried. It wasn't unusual for him to retreat into his space, but there was something in his gait that had caught my attention, something rushed, something almost secretive. I pulled a book from the shelf and tried to focus on the pages, but my mind kept wandering back to him. I glanced at the clock again. 7:30 p.m. Ethan wasn't one for staying cooped up in his room for too long, yet the door had remained closed for hours. The house seemed to pulse with an uneasy stillness, and an inexplicable urge to check on him slowly crept up my spine. I stood up and walked down the hallway, each step deliberate. The soft glow from the living room lamps cast long shadows on the walls. The door to Ethan's room was slightly ajar. I paused outside, hesitating for a brief moment. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I had been too sensitive, reading into something that wasn't there. But then, a sudden sound made my heart skip a beat, a rustling noise, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet. It was the kind of sound that could easily be ignored, but in my gut, it felt like a warning. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of his desk lamp. Ethan sat at his desk, his back turned to me, his focus locked on something in front of him. I couldn't quite make out the details, but the posture was off. He was hunched forward, too still, too absorbed. The silence between us grew thick. "Ethan," I called out, my voice calm but strained. He froze for a moment, his body stiffening. Slowly, he turned toward me, his face pale, eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't quite place. His lips parted as if he were about to speak but then closed again, the words seemingly stuck in his throat. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that wasn't there before. Ethan didn't respond. He just looked at me, his gaze darting toward the object in front of him, then back to me, before quickly glancing away. My eyes followed his, narrowing as they landed on a phone in his hand. But it wasn't just any phone, it was a screen flickering with something I never thought I'd see. My stomach twisted. Something was very wrong. Section 2. The shocking discovery. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Ethan's hands trembled slightly, his grip tightening on the phone as if he were trying to keep the world at bay. His eyes flicked to mine, then quickly darted away, his expression one of panic, guilt, and something else, something darker. "What's going on?" I managed to ask, my voice a little sharper than I intended. Ethan swallowed, the muscles in his throat working as he fought to find words. He looked so much younger in that moment, vulnerable and caught in something far beyond his understanding, or maybe, far too familiar. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was strained, unsure. It's nothing, Mom. Just a video." His words came out in a rush, but his voice lacked conviction, the kind of desperation in it that told me this was far from nothing. I stepped forward, my gaze falling back on the screen of his phone. The image burned into my mind, one I would never have expected, never imagined. A video. Of him. Of Ethan. His face was on the screen, but not in the way I'd seen him in years past, his smile, his usual confidence. No, this was different. It was a video of him in a dark room, a place I didn't recognize. He was talking to someone off-screen, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he was doing, or rather, what he was about to do. My breath caught in my throat. I knew. I didn't need to see any more. The room felt like it was closing in around me, the walls pressing in, suffocating me with the weight of what was unfolding. "Ethan, what is this?" I asked, my voice now trembling. He looked at me again, his eyes wide and panicked, as if he had just realized there was no way out of this moment. Slowly, he set the phone down on his desk, his fingers lingering on it, as if it were a lifeline he didn't want to let go of. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, there was only silence. I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was just a dumb mistake." I took a step closer, my mind reeling, trying to piece together what I was hearing. I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to understand. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Ethan, what exactly were you doing?" He hesitated, a flicker of something flashing across his face: shame, guilt, and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't ready to confront. Finally, his words came, each one heavier than the last. It's not what you think, Mom. I didn't want to. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." But it didn't matter what he said next. I could see it in his eyes. I could feel the truth, raw and undeniable, hanging between us. This wasn't a simple mistake. This was something else, something I couldn't yet understand but knew would change everything. Before I could speak again, Ethan quickly reached for the phone, his hands shaking. "Please don't," he began, but I was already moving. "No more lies, Ethan," I said, my voice tight, holding the weight of every unspoken word between us. Section 3, The Fallout. The air in the room was thick with tension, suffocating us both. I stood there, frozen, watching as Ethan's hands trembled over the phone. His face had gone pale, the sheen of sweat on his forehead betraying his anxiety. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was a physical weight, pushing against the walls, pressing down on my chest. "Mom, please," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, the fear evident in his eyes. "I didn't want this to happen. I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far." I wasn't sure what he was referring to: the video, the lie, or perhaps the things he wasn't ready to admit. My mind was a whirl of questions, none of them easy to answer. I had spent years thinking I understood my son, knowing him better than anyone else. But in that moment, everything felt distant, as if the child I had raised had suddenly become a stranger. I took a slow step forward, my gaze fixed on the phone still clutched in his hands. "What did you do, Ethan?" I asked again, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "What is all this?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller, to disappear from my gaze. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for any of it to go public. It was just something that I thought would stay between us. It was supposed to be a joke." I felt my stomach tighten. A joke? How could anything in that video be considered a joke? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. I wasn't sure if I was more angry or heartbroken, or maybe both. I glanced at the phone again, trying to calm my racing thoughts. There had been something disturbing about it, something that felt too serious to be a mere prank or mistake. It wasn't just the video itself, it was the way Ethan was avoiding the truth, the way he tried to minimize everything. I had seen that same defense mechanism in other kids, but not my son. Not Ethan. "I need to understand," I said, my voice firm, determined not to let him off the hook. "What was going on in that video? What were you doing?" Ethan turned away, his eyes downcast, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. For a long time, he didn't answer. I could hear his breath catch in his throat, the weight of the secret between us becoming unbearable. Then, almost reluctantly, he spoke. It was a dare," he admitted, his words coming out in a rush. "Some guys at school, they dared me to do it. I didn't want to, but I thought it was just something stupid. I didn't realize how serious it was. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen like this." A cold chill ran through me. A dare. That was the excuse. I had heard it before, but never like this. I could hear the underlying desperation in his voice, the way he tried to make it sound like something that could be brushed off. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my chest, the sense that my son was caught in something far beyond a harmless prank. I wanted to say something, to ask him how he could have let himself get involved in something like this, but the words felt stuck, frozen in my throat. This wasn't just about a mistake or a foolish dare anymore. This was about trust that had been broken, perhaps irreparably. I'm going to need you to explain everything, Ethan, I said, my voice steady, though my heart ached. Every single thing. And we're going to deal with it together. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since I entered the room. There was something different about him now, his vulnerability, his fear, his guilt. But the most unsettling part was the realization that this was just the beginning. Section 4. The Aftermath and Resolution. The days after that confrontation felt like a fog, thick and unyielding, wrapping itself around everything. I could barely remember the specifics of the conversation after I had left Ethan's room, but I knew it had left a crack in the foundation of our relationship. It wasn't something we could just sweep under the rug. Ethan had gone quiet, too quiet. The boy who had once filled the house with his laughter, his constant chatter, was now a mere shadow of himself. I saw him only at the dinner table, where he pushed food around his plate in silence. His eyes were distant, and his answers to my questions were short, as if he were trying to distance himself from everything. From me. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to fix him. As a mother, it was supposed to be instinctual, right? The answers, the solutions, the way to heal the wounds before they became permanent. But this was different. This wasn't a scraped knee or a bad grade on a test. This was a fracture in the very core of our relationship, one that couldn't be healed with just a hug or a comforting word. There were deeper currents at play, and I had no idea how far they ran. I knew one thing, though, I had to keep trying. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned, and there was Ethan, standing in the doorway. His eyes were no longer averted from mine, and there was something different in his posture, less defensive, more open. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative, almost apologetic. "Can we talk?" I set my phone down, my heart giving a small leap. This was the first time in days he had willingly approached me, and I wasn't going to waste it. "Of course," I said softly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Sit down." He did, but the space between us felt larger than it should have been. I didn't know where to begin. So, I let him take the first step. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet, but steady. "For everything. I didn't mean for things to get out of control. I didn't realize how much it would hurt you." I held his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his words. "Ethan," I said, the hurt in my voice lingering, "it's not just about the video. It's about you hiding things from me. About the fact that you felt like you couldn't tell me what was really going on." He looked away, his hands clasping together in his lap. "I didn't know how to explain. I didn't think you'd understand, or that you'd be disappointed. I was stupid, Mom. I know that now." I took a deep breath, letting the tension seep out of my shoulders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that moment, something had shifted. There was a flicker of the son I once knew, the one who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to admit his mistakes. "You're not stupid," I said quietly. "But you have to understand that the truth is always better than hiding things. We're a team, Ethan. And if you're struggling, you don't have to do it alone." Ethan nodded, his eyes softening. "I'll try, Mom. I promise." I wasn't naive enough to believe that everything would be okay overnight. But for the first time since that moment I'd caught him in his room, I felt a small, fragile hope stir inside me. We had a long way to go, but at least we were taking the first step. Together. As I watched him leave the kitchen, his shoulders a little lighter, I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But I also knew we would make it through, piece by piece, as long as we kept talking.